Okay, well, today we continue in the book of Matthew, reading from chapter 26, verses 57 through 60. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. All right, so we read today of a council of leaders, and these were ones who ruled the religious life of the Jews in those days, and they were called the Sanhedrin. Representatives of all of the major factions of religious political life were present on this council: Pharisees, Sadducees, chief priests, elders. Led by Caiaphas and a man named Annas, this council represented the collective wisdom of the leaders of God's people. These were, of course, the very people who had been plotting to kill Jesus for some time now, which is why Matthew says that they were looking for false testimony. Not necessarily because they said to themselves, hey, let's find someone to lie about Jesus. Theoretically, they themselves could have contrived an entire story about Jesus, which was a complete lie, and then just hired some goon to repeat it. But this is not what Matthew means when he writes that the council was seeking after false testimony. What the council was seeking was testimony that was true, that they could twist to fit what they were looking to do. Not a complete fabrication, but something that they could twist and then use as a plausible basis for Jesus' arrest and guilty verdict. And this is why Matthew calls it false, because it was fabricated justice that they were looking for. I mean, they already arrested Jesus, and only after the fact of his arrest, now they are searching for testimony against him. And it appears that there was a bit of a delay, as Matthew records for us. Apparently, at first, they were unable to find anything that they could use for their purposes. Of course, as Matthew knows full well, and as we all know, Jesus was innocent. And so, in some sense, these difficulties come as no surprise. But in the end, they found something that they could use, although it really wasn't much, as we will see, reading now from the end of verse 60. At last, two came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. And that was Matthew 26, 60 through 63. Now, these were not exactly the words that Christ had said, and the witnesses certainly are framing things in a very negative light. And really, this was the kind of thing I guess the leaders were looking for here. To speak against the temple would be construed as speaking against God, but we know Jesus never did this. But that's what they thought that they had on him with this. Now, what Jesus had actually said was, tear down this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. And of course, the temple that he was referring to was his own body. And he knew they would kill him. Yes, Christ knew what they were going to do. But he also knew that his authority as the Christ would be proven in his resurrection 3 days later. It is ironic then that these are the very words they used to bring about his death. Now, I think at this point the high priest knows the evidence is flimsy, and I think he wants Jesus to say more about the testimony given by these false witnesses, and hopefully find something more in what Jesus says in his response to this that would strengthen their case. But, as we see, Jesus does not bite. Jesus remains silent before their ridiculous accusations. They twist his words, but he does not correct them. He gives them nothing more to go on than their own evil machinations. And so that's it. The high priest probably knows this is not enough. People might question the execution of this man on these charges alone. So it is interesting what comes next. Now, the temple has been mentioned, And the high priest knows that many looked forward to the Messiah as a person who would reform the temple, and so at that moment he sees his opportunity to corner Jesus. And here's what he says, reading from the rest of verse 63. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now, as the high priest, Caiaphas had the legal power to demand a confession from the person that he was interrogating. And so if Jesus refused to answer this formal and legally binding inquiry, well, then he would, in a way, be guilty of sin. And so what are Jesus' options if he denies that he is the Messiah? Well, I suppose that would have suited the council, I guess, although they wanted to kill him, but they could use this perhaps then to dismiss everything else that Jesus had done up until this point. Of course, Jesus was the Messiah, so he wasn't going to lie. And I think that they knew that, or at least that they knew that he was going to say he was the Messiah. That was the point of all of this. This is what they were expecting. But if he did, then that would be the evidence that they would use against him. You see, they had already made up their minds against Jesus, that he was not the Messiah. And so the minute he openly said that he was, well, that's what they needed. So how does Jesus answer? Well, here it is, reading from verse 64. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need against him? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment? They answered, he deserves death. Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it who struck you? And so the confession of Jesus' identity is made, but they call it blasphemy. He reveals the truth to them, but they call it a lie. They hated him all along because he told them the truth, but now they convict God himself of the sin of speaking against God, of blasphemy. And they will put God to death for telling them who he really is. We must ponder on this. It is hard to say anything at all about this, but let us see what this shows us about the world. Let us see what this shows us about the darkness that covers the eyes of sinful men. And let us see this is the reality of the world that we live in even today. For they still mock him to this day. To this day, they still call the truth a lie. They still set their hearts against them. They spit on him and deny him, and they call him false. They do not see him for who he is. They do not give ear to the confession that he has made from his own mouth, that he is the one whose place is at the right hand of God, and he is the one who will be coming in the clouds. Jesus references with these words perhaps the most important messianic imagery we find in the Old Testament from the book of Daniel, speaking of the Son of Man who ascends into the throne room of God and is given all authority over God's people and over all of the earth. And this is what Christ will do after he lays down his life and after he picks it up again on the third day as he foretold. Every word he said was true. This is what this is. When put to it, in the moment, Christ will not deny himself. And so with that confession, he is sealed in his fate. But what of Peter? We had read that he was following the Lord at a distance. What was he doing there? Yes, Peter was there, in the vicinity at least, when all of this was going down. Well, let's read of what became of Peter. Reading now from verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you mean. And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. And so, as Christ foretold, the leader of his disciples and his closest friend denied any association with him. Christ knew that it had to be this way. The one who came to bear the sorrows of men was foretold as despised and rejected by men. The one who came to bring us into joyful relationship with God would be a man of sorrow and well acquainted with grief. Sorrow and grief. And we all know of the physical suffering that Christ endured on the cross. Perhaps we have dared imagine the pain that he must have felt as those iron nails were driven into his hands and were driven into his feet, and as he was affixed to a piece of wood and raised up to just hang there. A slow and painful death. But there was a greater pain. We have read how he was slapped and mocked. And we will read over the upcoming weeks how they continued to shame him, stripping him naked and having him march through the streets as a criminal, to suffer the injustice of a corrupt system, to be crushed under the weight of political power plays and conspiracies. All of these things are a part of the suffering that he endured for us. There are very few things more painful for a human being than having their dignity wrongfully stripped away, being publicly humiliated and disgraced, watching as every one of your friends fail you and turn away from you, of knowing the truth about those who claim to love you even before they do. I have often pondered the verse right after Peter's denial of Christ. We are told that Peter went out and wept bitterly. What is this? And I will tell you what this is. One does not weep bitterly simply because they disappoint a friend. Peter did not weep bitterly because he realized he let Christ down. Does Peter feel regret for what he has done? There can be no doubt. But if he truly regretted it, he would have gone back. He would have fought his way back and corrected his mistake. He would have shouted, "I am the man you say. I am the man that I said all along. See, I am Peter. I am a follower of Christ." But what does Peter do? Because that is why we cannot say that Peter cried simply because he regretted that he betrayed Jesus. Otherwise, he would have done that. You see, a man does not weep bitterly for this. Rather, a man weeps bitterly when he realizes that his entire life is a lie. When he looks deep within himself and sees only meaningless darkness of a pointless existence. A man weeps bitterly when he comes face to face with the reality of what this world is and that he is a part of that world. The world that has no place for beautiful things like true friendship, loyalty, unfailing love. A man weeps bitterly when he looks into the mirror of his own soul and realizes that he has played his own part in the death of God. And you know, all of this isn't even about Peter. Do not feel sorry for Peter. Peter made his choices. This is who Peter was, because this is what his decisions made him to be. The person this is about is Jesus, because Jesus didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve any of it. And the craziest thing about all of this is that Jesus knew the truth about Peter from the very beginning. All along, Jesus knew Peter was a fraud, that he was a flake, a blowhard, that when push came to shove, even though Peter talked a big game about how much he loved Jesus, when push came to shove, Peter was going to fold like a house of cards. But it's not actually the craziest thing about all of this that Jesus knew. The craziest thing about all of this is that Jesus knew all of this about Peter, but he loved him anyways. And you know what else? Jesus knows everything about every one of us. The deepest, darkest parts about us. Jesus knows it. Jesus knows things about us that we don't even know about ourselves. And he loves us anyways. In fact, that was entirely the point of all of this. Jesus took the pain and the punishment for what he did not deserve in order to bring into the world the love that he has for us, the love that he has always had for us, the love that we do not deserve. And I cannot explain to you how it is. I cannot explain to you how God has love in the depths of his heart for a person like me. I cannot explain it, but I can say that it is true. That while we were yet sinners, Jesus died for us. And I can tell you that we are made his own through faith in what his love accomplished for us. There is no greater love than this, than to lay down your life for your friends. And I feel that there is no greater thing for us to desire in our life than to have this love. Have it for ourselves, but also, just like Jesus, to somehow have this love in our own hearts for others as well. And I've spent my adult life studying the Bible and learning everything I can about God and about his love, but at the end of the day, all of this information is just that. It's information. And please do not take me wrong. If you know me at all, then you know I would never do anything other than honor what we find in the scripture. I do not devalue in any way this information, but our faith is more than information. There is no getting around this. And I have found that faith cannot be expressed truly without this, that we have this love in us, the love Christ has as he endures all of these things. And that we must show this love to others. Without this love, we are nothing. This love that Christ had for Peter, when we know something about someone, something so ugly, when we see someone in the bad lighting of their natural habitat, when we see them, how shall we say it, warts and all, when they fail us, when they betray us, when they flake on us, when they are everything they always were, only now it is plain as day. Do we despise them? Do we say, oh, that's who you really are. Forget you. You know what? We could do that. But is that what Christ's love has shown us? And if we can't see someone for who they really are and say to ourselves, I will love them, then is our Christianity anything more than information? Really? The most knowledgeable theologian who ever lived, the Apostle Paul, wrote this: knowledge makes arrogant, but love builds up. And one way to understand what that means is to say what a person knows, the knowledge that they have about God, this will build themselves up in their own eyes. But the way you love is to build others up around you. And as we've seen today, the only way to truly love is to love others despite their flaws. And when we do this, we have the love that God had for Peter. Listen, God's love for Peter, it didn't make what Peter did okay. Not by a long shot. But that is not what we are talking about here. What we are talking about is how we love others, how we build something beautiful here in this place. And it starts with what's in us. Yes, we all want to be better, to be more than our faults and our flaws, and we want that for others as well. But listen, none of that matters if we don't first have God's love in us. Do we have God's love? Do we love others with God's love? And this is what it means to be a Christian. God help us to be a Christian in our hearts.